Okay, in this week one video, I want to try to help you have a better idea of the context and the structure of the Constitution. You need to understand from the very beginning that this is essentially, at its root, about the slave trade practice and the controversy at that time. This begins as early as the early 1600s. So you have to kind of think about this. We're now going into the 1760s and the 1770s. And these men who are having this conversation are largely in their 30s up into their 50s. Remember, people didn't live as long as they do today. So they have experienced the slave trade practice for several generations. Many of them were born into the practice and born into owning slaves. So this is the background and the structure that they're debating the Constitution. So this really doesn't have anything to do with rights at this point as we think about them today. So the first kind of issue is starting with Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. You have to understand that this is about crisis and compromise. So those two things coming into contrast with each other. And this clause is the compromise. It's saying that they're going to push off this debate. They're not going to allow the federal government to cancel slavery, the slave trade practice, until the year 1808. And so this is essentially saying that the next generation, and really almost two generations later, will have to take this issue up. The idea here is that they're being optimistic. They're saying that hopefully each of the 13 state legislatures will ban the practice of the slave trade, meaning you are no longer allowed to go and kidnap people or rob other slave ships and take on those human beings as your personal property. Again, this is exceedingly optimistic, right? And this doesn't do anything to affect those who are already enslaved under this system. So this is really, the big question is, why does this occur? This occurs because of developments in England and in some of the colonies. There are larger movements now to abolish the slave trade practice, and those strongest arguments come from white men who are educated and have generally are lawyers or judges who are arguing that the slave trade practice is immoral and that it's dehumanizing both to Africans and to Englishmen. They're largely contrasting themselves to the Spanish Catholic and the French at this time. And so this is also a geopolitical or international relations argument. They're basically saying at the heart of it that this isn't, quote unquote, who we are as a people. And you can find lots of examples of these writings, but they're not usually the people that you're familiar with. So it's not Thomas Jefferson who's saying this. It's not Ben Franklin who's saying this. It's people like Joseph Story. There's people in England who are making these arguments, like William Blackstone. And there's people even in Virginia in the South that are making these arguments as well. And so you have to kind of just frame it that way. George Mason is that example. And so they're not really thinking about this from the point of view of the enslaved Africans. They're thinking about what it says about themselves as quote unquote white men. And so this is what we mean, the convergence of white interests. There's enough people now that are arguing against slavery that this is part of the compromise now. And so this is why it's a crisis, is there's enough people who are viewing it as a crisis. That's why we have to think about this. A lot of times students get confused, is that it's obviously a moral argument to say that the slave practice and the treating of human beings based on the color of their skin is morally wrong. I agree. That doesn't make it illegal. And in other words, things that are immoral can certainly be legal. And so we have to really think about that as we go through this, what's called rights consciousness, as people start to think about not just morals, but also due process and law. And so you have to think about any injustice that's going on now as a process, as a long historical process, because this is the structure that we all operate in. It's the structure of the United States Constitution. So the Fugitive Slave Clause is the second kind of way of looking at the Constitution. It's in Article 4. And this is really best understood as the reasons for keeping slavery. So again, I kind of said this already, but we're 15 generations into the Atlantic slave trade practice. So people have gotten used to this. You can think about it, I think a good comparison that Michelle Alexander has made is the present prison system. We've been doing this, the existing prison system, since the end of the Civil War. And so that's actually about the same amount of time, is the 15 generations. People got used to it. They see it as normal. They say, well, it's normal to have prisons. It was the same thing in 1770s. People would say it's normal to have slaves, and it's normal to have African slaves. People would know which region of Africa, whether they came from the Caribbean, right? There was brands, the same way we think about brands today. So people were just kind of taking this as a necessary evil, is what they would generally refer to it. But it's also about existing wealth, right? You have to remember that the people who are in power before the American Revolution are wealthy people, and they got their wealth largely through the slave trade practice. And so they have a lot of influence. You also have to see this within the sphere of international relations, right? The English did not invent the slave trade practice. I mean, no country invented the slave trade practice, right? This is an ancient kind of process. And this is how people were kind of competing with each other during the colonial era. You had the British trying to compete with the Portuguese and the Spanish. You had the French trying to compete. And so they all saw, at least towards the beginning, as the slave trade practice as a way of establishing their influence as countries and saying we're a modern country. Probably one of the most aggressive examples of this is the French in Haiti and the revolution in Haiti. Napoleon was insistent that they needed to keep the slave trade practice going on in Haiti. So you see this as kind of not just an issue between domestic politics, but also international politics. The other issue is the most complicated one, is the one that is probably the most immoral from my point of view, which is that people largely had the belief that Africans were being helped by being slaves. And the argument was known within the Catholic Church as a form of liberation. And so, slaves were being educated, quote unquote, and trained and civilized. And this is a deeply racist, supremacist concept. This wasn't just limited to the Catholic Church. The Protestants used this same idea, and then you started getting what's called American exceptionalism. People started saying, essentially that they deserved slaves. People were pointing to passages in the Bible saying that this is what justifies them holding slaves. So this was not just economic interests, it was also about belief systems and religion and what people thought was the natural order. The other argument, I don't think this is a great argument, but it was a very popular argument at the time, was that there were no alternatives. And in other words, they were saying the economy is based on slavery, there's nothing else out there, what are we supposed to do? This is the way the world works, or it is what it is the famous New York saying. And a lot of this was, the reason why it wasn't a very good argument is that the argument that followed it was based out of fear. So if the argument was, especially in the South, was, well, if we suddenly free formerly enslaved peoples, they're going to rise up against us and kill us all. Now, there was no evidence of that. There was evidence of uprisings and rebellions, slaves who wanted to no longer be slaves and to be free, perfectly natural from my point of view. But this kind of created a story or a myth that this was going to be a race issue. So you see this is racialized again. So it's no longer about enslaved humans not wanting to be slaves. It's about, black people are going to hurt and ruin the lives of white people. This same excuse was used with dominating American Indians. It was the same idea. Well, if we don't execute them, they're going to execute us in our sleep. This is this kind of way of racializing arguments that makes white people superior and therefore entitled to dominate and discriminate against others. And you can see here in the text, it's pretty aggressive, right? That even if you are able to escape, the law says that you must be returned. And so it's not just that your property, when you're in ownership, it's you're also remain property even when you're out of the possession of the person. Now the third one is pretty commonly known well as the 3/5 rule. Now it's more complicated than I think what people generally think, but they're starting off on the right foot. That they know that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to voting. They were not allowed to vote, so if somebody had 100 slaves, roughly 35% of their vote would be increased, right? So they'd get 36 votes if they had 100 slaves. But this is more important to show you that what the Constitution is doing here is they're creating levels of citizenship. And you hear this echoed in the immigration debates today. And even the way that people are framing, if I refer to pop culture right now, as Afghanistan refugees as deserving of becoming residents in the United States. This is still that 3 levels of citizenship concept. Notice that people aren't saying that all people should get to be citizens of the United States. They're basically essentially saying that some people are deserving of living here. And so they probably don't know that this idea and this way of thinking comes from the Constitution, but it does. And so you see here in the text, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, is that basically if you're a white landowning male, you're a whole person. And that's why you are granted a whole number as a free person. Now, you can still be a whole person if you're an indentured servant, which means you have a contract. Today, this is just wage labor. You get paid $8 an hour, $15 an hour, $100,000 a year, whatever the term is, right? I mean, baseball players too, right? You get $3.5 million if you do this, this, and this. So it's a contract. So you can either be a whole white person, free person, by land ownership, and so now you're born free, or you can be contracted into being a full white whole person. And I say white because at this time that's all this included, and it was just men, so I should say white men. No one else is included in this full whole person entitled to a whole vote. Now notice that Indians are excluded altogether unless they agree to be taxed. There were quite a few Indians who lived amongst the colonists and therefore were taxed. I don't have any record that they were allowed to vote, but this is something that you can think of in sociology as passing as white. If you passed as white, then you owned property, or you were a servant working for another whole person, then you probably were counted in the census and perhaps in the local delegates. Again, there are no records that indicate that as far as I'm aware or have seen. Now, the 3/5 of a person, they even, very interesting in this is they say other persons, right? And so other creates this really broad category. So you'd be 3/5 of a person, obviously, if you're not a whole person. And so this would go to slaves in particular, but theoretically, right, logically, you could extend this to a lot of other people. It could be residents, it could be children, it could be women, it could be foreigners, right, people who are passing through, tourists kind of thing. But then it would refer to state and local law to see whether you'd be allowed to vote, and get the benefits of citizenship. But again, the point here of this 3/5 rule is to show you that the Constitution sets up as a vision levels of citizenship, that people are not equal in their rights. Now, most people know this, right? This whole thing is intended to make sure that the property holders keep their property, and that's why it's white landowning men are at the highest point of the hierarchy. But a lot of people don't know that this was not a secret. So James Madison, who was one of the chief framers of the United States Constitution, took the notes, organized the convention procedures, was president of the United States, Secretary of State. I mean, he was a very influential figure. Said many times in many different writings that the first purpose of this entire new government, of this legal constitutional order, is to protect different faculties for acquiring property. Meaning, this is not a government or a constitution that's designed to create equality. It is to maintain the separate divisions. And this is because it's written from people and for people who have property. And so they don't want to. So let's go through the process of how this happened for these men. The first thing is they took property from the king. And that's something you should have learned, right, in American history class. I think sometimes we focus a lot in the propaganda and the media. We tend to say things like, well, this was about inalienable rights and all this. And surely, that was the language that Thomas Jefferson used. But if you look at the facts and you look at the history, this was about a fight, largely, about whose property was whose. From the king's point of view, in England, all the property was the king's property. And so he levied taxes through Parliament in England and through the representative government in the colonies. And the founders, the framers, the colonists, didn't think they should have to pay those taxes. I hear people talking like this all the time. You probably do too, right? They don't think they should have to pay taxes to the government. Okay, so they took the property that was the king's, and then they took it for themselves, and now it's their property. Obviously they had to go to war, and they fought over it, and they won. So that's their first step. The next one is that it allowed, and the king actually allowed this, to take property from the Indians. It could take their land, and this is pretty widely known. But they were also fighting against the French in the West, which at that time was like Missouri and Ohio, and the Spanish in the West and South, which at that time was either Mexico or Texas, depending on which side of that debate you want to be on, and Florida, and much of the islands off of the coast of Florida, including Cuba. And so, this was essentially like a free pass to say that you can take land from other people as long as they're not full citizens of the United States. And, we call this pioneers, westward expansion, all these different phrases. But, here's the fact. The other thing is that we are enforcing the taking of property in courts, and that's largely what courts are established for, and that's to protect this different property. So if you claim that you have the right to property, well, we go to court and we'll let the judge decide. And a lot of this is going to come down to contracts, deeds and property, titles, registration. And so you really have to be, quote unquote, in with the government in order to enforce your property rights. This also allowed for property, real estate, houses, material goods like corn or tobacco or pigs or whatever the person, right, is selling, and humans. And so this is now passed down to their children, right? And this is what we know as wills or trusts and estates. And something that a lot of people don't know. At this time, it was a very, very widespread common practice for a child to have been given a slave as early as 6 to 8 years old. This was oftentimes another child so that they would learn how to enslave another human being who was around their same age. And this was their property. It was legally binding as their property. So this is the background of having the constitutional framework in the first place. The other one is interesting because it doesn't seem like it's harmful, and probably in your American government class it was presented as it isn't harmful. So I wanted to show you a little differently here. it's not harmful in itself, right? Obviously, a pyramid is not harmful. And a lot of times teachers and scholars tend to just start at the bottom of the pyramid and work their way up, and so they miss kind of the point. This design, and this is the Federalist Papers that argues this a lot, Alexander Hamilton being the prime person, is that it's the other way around. You need to start with the federal government and work your way down. So the federal government has the most power. And then when you move down to the city level, the city government, they don't have many powers. What they have is the power of social influence, right? Because they know who you are. And so it's really social groups at the bottom of the pyramid have more power. At the top of the pyramid, it's a handful of people, not necessarily representatives of a social group. And this is well documented and really kind of common sense. But a lot of teachers and a lot of textbooks miss this point, I guess because they're not looking. But Article 4, Section 2 guarantees that the United States government will maintain this system. So people sometimes ask, well, how come we can't have a multi-party system? How come we can't have a socialist government? How come we can't have, or people are terrified there's going to be a communist government. It's not constitutionally possible. I'm not saying it's not impossible that people can change the Constitution or even get rid of it or have another revolution. But what I'm saying is that it will not happen because Joe Biden is elected president. That's insane. It won't happen because AOC makes a speech and sends it out over Instagram. It won't happen because Bernie Sanders travels down to Florida and talks to some people. The idea here is that just like a chain of command in the military, and this has got to remember, right? George Washington is a general at the time. It's a military government that is formed after the Revolutionary War. So they want authority to be formed at each level. So this is where separation of powers really comes in, is that it's a pretty picture on the pyramid here, the triangle, to say that there's authority, through the whole system. So the highest authority is at the top and the lowest authority is at the bottom. But the reality is that the authority is smaller than that. So there's authority at the city level, there's authority at the county level, there's authority at the state level, then there's authority at the regional level, or Congress is what we tend to call that, and then there's authority at the federal level, the administrative executive branches. And so it's not so much that one person has control, it's that at each level, one to a small handful of people have control. And so then they are the ones who conspire, which is a normal legal term. It's not means what it means on TV, but they work together to ensure their interests. So mostly money and influence flows up, not down, right? It doesn't trickle down, it goes up. And usually what you'll see, Rahm Emanuel being a controversial example right now is, he's now a diplomat, right? He was the mayor of Chicago before. Before that, he worked in Barack Obama's administration. And so this is how it generally works. People work at the top levels of each of these sections of the system. That's by design. That's the intentional design of this system. Like I said, Madison starts out as the framer of the Constitution. He then becomes Secretary of State. He was in Congress. He runs for president. This is the point of the system. Again, it's to maintain power in the hands of the people who are watching over property. So there's a lot of talk, especially among Democratic liberal progressives and among the Trump supporters on the right, that they need grassroots movements. I have worked with and for grassroots movements. I study grassroots movements. It's improbable. It very rarely, if ever, I would say never, change doesn't happen at the bottom. Change has to come at the top, which again, if you want to change the military, you don't start with the infantry. You'd have to start with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You got to start at the top. You want to change your workplace. It might be nice, right, to be in the break room, and I'll talk about how you're going to take over. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to change the CEO. You're going to have to change the board of directors. You're going to have to change the management. So these things usually have to work together, but this system designs it so that can't happen. They do not want what Alexander Hamilton called the tyranny of the mob. The other one is interesting. This one gets some attention, but you can change the Constitution, right? You can amend the Constitution, and as you know, it's been amended 27 times, including the first 10, which are the Bill of Rights. And that's important to pause for a second. So the Bill of Rights are not the Constitution. They are amendments to the Constitution. So none of the amendments have changed any of the things I just described. So all of those things stayed the same. The 27 amendments have added or modified parts that really have nothing to do with those other 5. So what is this process? Well, if you look over here to the right, it's not easy. It's extremely difficult. So when you think about convergence and white convergence, that explains the 27 times the Constitution has changed, as there was enough widespread approval among those who were able to vote. And you got to think, right, the first 10 to 14 of the, really 15 of the amendments were still only white men, landowning men, who were making those changes. So this is what I call, a game of blocking change. This is not so much to get a change to occur, say like voting rights, which is why voting rights is actually comes out of Congress. It's more about keeping the changes to be manageable and things that power group wants to keep. So a good question would be, so how did the Bill of Rights happen? Well, it was a bargaining process that really was about slavery. And so I know today we tend to look at the Bill of Rights as progressive things, but they were not progressive at the time. They were ways of checking the power of the federal government so that they couldn't essentially boss them around and tell them what to do, specifically with the issue of slavery. They were worried. I mean, a lot of those provisions, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment, for example, are things that existed in imperial or the king parliament in England. Those were not in the Constitution for the most part. So it wasn't clear that you had a right to an attorney. It wasn't clear that there was a ban on excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment. So the South, again, was nervous that if Congress, if the federal government made slavery a crime, then they'd all be in big trouble. And so the same thing can be said about the other amendments, with the exception of after the 14th Amendment, right? You've changed the voting structure of the country. And so now there's a big difference as far as the pressure that can be applied on those in power. And that's why voting rights and really having maximum voting, right, getting everyone to vote, makes a much bigger difference. The fewer people who vote, the less likely any change is going to happen. However, after all of that, this still has to be in the interests of the representatives that we have voted for, or that you have voted for, which is going to represent the majority of voters and donors, not the population. This always seems to get, confused. About a third to 40% of the total population actually votes. A much smaller number than that donates money to campaigns. And so it has to be in the interest of those groups in order for there to be actual change. Not just a change of hearts and minds, but a change of practice, of behaviors, and of the structure of the Constitution. So some of you might be thinking, well, this has all been divisive. Or this is kind of the claim that, on both sides actually, I'm kind of exhausted by it, but you've got the right-wing Republicans are saying their understanding of critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, and liberal progressives is divisive and it's tearing the country apart. Then the people on the left, the liberal progressives, are saying the Trump supporters, the anti-vaxxers, and blah, 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 they're dividing the country. Well, let's go back. The country has been divided since day one and before day one. And so nobody is dividing the country. It is just as divided as it always has been. And that's partially if you design a game and the game's rules are that you must be divisive and that one group is going to maintain control and the other group is going to complain, what do you think the game is going to do? It's going to do exactly what you designed it to. So I want to use an example here. If you think deeply about the First Amendment, ask yourself, why would they fight so hard in the First Amendment, the very first one? Why would you fight to make sure that the press, the media, had the ability to criticize the government without being thrown in jail? Now, I'm not going to answer that question because I want you to think about it. I want you to think about it in this class. Why would that be the first thing that you want to change after I described all those issues? And then the second one would be, why provide a refusal to comply with law on religious moral privileges? In other words, first part of the First Amendment is about protecting the free speech of the press. People get very confused about that. They think they have free speech, but they didn't read the First Amendment very carefully. It's the press has free speech. So you have free speech in the sense that you can write a letter to the news and the news can publish it, but you don't hold free speech. In fact, you don't hold any individual rights in America. But the second one is you also don't have an individual right to religion. You have a group religion. But if you read the First Amendment carefully, again, it provides the opportunity for the government to reject your religious claims in the benefit of the federal government. So this tells you something, right? The constitutional government does not want to make its decisions on your individual point of view. They want to look at the majority of voters and donors, and again, that first tier of citizenship, or that highest one. And so this is because the argument is then and now arguing about abolition and maintaining racial capitalism, or the current economic system. One that says that some people deserve and other people do not. Some people should own and some people should rent. Some people should work and some people should have capital. Some people should be in jail, some people should be in rehab, right? This is the whole point of dividing up the people, because they were divided at the beginning. And remember, it's a crisis, and what they're doing is trying to make a compromise. And so dialogue is not divisive, but the game is, right? The way that you use dialogue can be. So something to think about as you go through this work. Now, I assume this is not what you expected. Some of you may have expected this, but what you need to remember is this Constitution was never written for us. It was written for just a small group of people. And so if you want to think about it today, over time, look how many more people are voting. So that changes the dynamics of who is in charge, quote unquote, or who is the majority. And so look there still, it's still less than 45% of the total population. And if about 60% now, according to the last census, are white people, and white people actually tend to vote more than the other groups, then you can see that's who's dominating the constitutional structure of government. But then ask yourself, who also dominates educational and institutional organizations, right? Who dominates the media? Who dominates businesses? Who are the CEOs, right? If you start just thinking about it this way, who were your teachers growing up? Who are teachers on average across the country? In higher education, it's mostly white people who are educators. The same thing in K through 12. And so that's the culture that is most represented in the constitutional government. And so you want to think about what are their interests. Largely it's going to be about themselves, right? And if you look in just kind of how people break down within the groups, you see white evangelicals, white men who have not gone to college, and a smaller percentage are from the South. And so that's the Republican Party. That is their point of view. That's their belief system. The Democrats, on the other hand, are mostly not religious, or they say that they're not religious, right? You never know what they really believe. They tend to be not from the South, but from the Northeast and the West Coast, and they have an equal number of black women as to the rural South, right? So the Republican Party are largely white Southern men who didn't go to college and who believe in an evangelical Jesus. And the Democrats are largely dominated by agnostics who come from wealthier backgrounds and went to college in the Northeast and the West. And that the viewpoint there if you think about Black Lives Matter, for example, is being represented by a larger share of black women than in the Republican Party. Now, some of this is probably common sense to most of you. But if you look at those numbers, right, they're pretty tight. There's not a lot of room in the parties for those of us who have multiple identities. And so you can see we're not really represented in this structure at all. It's pretty much still based in racial divisions, just like it was in the 1770s. But law, and constitutional law in particular, has become a double-edged sword. It might have been designed, the sword, to cut one way, but it actually cuts both ways. Once people become aware of the structure, aware of the system, aware of discrimination and injustice, they tend to fight back using the law, using politics, and using what are called rights talk, demands, and that turns into social organizing. So that's something to kind of think about as we go to this class, is that you can design a game to be one way, but people can start to figure out that the game's not fair and use cheat codes to steal some video game language. So that's all I wanted to do for this first week, to let you know that that's kind of where we're going, is to now try to unpack this and understand it better. And I hope that this brief interview just kind of, or video just gives you a basic idea of what the United States Constitution is and how that's different than what you were thinking probably about rights. We will talk about rights, but I don't want you to get those confused. They're not the same thing. The Constitution is a structural document. It's not a rights document.